Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 132nd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And this month's theme is all about recognition, in particular, recognizing things we may take for granted and things outside our sphere of reference. So on today's episode for International Women's Day, the theme is Breaking the Bias for 2022. And if you're a regular listener, or if this is your first episode and you enjoy it, why not leave me a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts? In addition, I really love hearing from listeners. So if you want to drop me a line, please do. Details are all in the show notes and I will reply directly. So why did I decide to make an episode on this topic? Well, as breaking the bias is the theme for this year's International Women's Day, I thought I would share tips and ideas how to really challenge and erode biases that may be present in the workplace. The International Women's Day website states, whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it difficult for women to move ahead. Knowing that bias exists isn't enough. Action is needed to level the playing field. Individually, we're all responsible for our own thoughts and actions all day, every day. We can break the bias in our communities, we can break the bias in our workplaces, we can break the bias in our schools, colleges, and universities. Together, we can break the bias on International Women's Day and beyond. And the whole idea of the campaign is for you to send in photos on social media or to the website to show yourself crossing arms in an X to show solidarity around breaking the bias. Now, while I think this is a great campaign and it's really visual and people can get involved with it, I do think that breaking the bias takes a lot more than simply doing this photo campaign. Absolutely everyone has to work towards systemic change. And in last week's episode number 131, I spoke more about bias and the types of bias. So if you're interested in that, where I do a deep dive, go back and have a listen to that episode. I also showcase how True Crime podcasts can help us look at bias and explore how they take place day to day. But in terms of the data for the UK, we know that the gender pay gap is still sadly well and alive at 15.4% for 2021. And this is tragic, and that most women essentially work for free from around the 20th of November each year until the 31st of December. If we then add to this ethnicity, disability, caring responsibilities, etc., we also see a widening of pension gaps, opportunities, and being able to build a positive future easily due to these systemic inequities. I've also included a link to Statista in the show notes if you want to have a look, but I thought that there were some really useful insights there. So in terms of position of power, it talks about the fact that the share of female CEOs at FTSE 100 companies is 8%. Bearing in mind initiatives like the 30% Club, we're really nowhere there yet. The share of female CEOs at FTSE 250 companies stands at 3.6%. The share of female executive directors at FTSE 100 companies, 14.2%. Proportion of female MPs in the UK House of Commons, which has grown obviously in the last 30 years, but it's still only 34%. And there's some interesting things on Viewpoint. So share of women who think more should be done to address sexual misconduct is an incredibly high 82%, and rightly so. I recently visited a very powerful arts exhibition on female sexual survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Absolutely gut-wrenching, and something we do not talk enough about in this country, and any country actually. Perhaps people think we're more ahead, and the funding and the grappling around that women's organisations have to do to support survivors of sexual abuse is just shocking. It shouldn't be the case. Share of women who think equality of household responsibilities has been achieved stands at 12%. And again, I know many of my friends who choose to start a family and have children find that this gap widens once they become parents. The share of women who think that there is an equal balance in gender politics stands at 13%, and the share of women who think that gender equality in pay has been achieved stands at 23%. There's also a lot more. If you love data, please have a look at that website. As I said, the link is in the show notes, and it gives you a much more of a deep dive by different years and different topics. But really helpful, I think, to show that it's not just about breaking the bias, the day-to-day impacts that this is having. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and you want to keep up to date. Then why not join my bi-monthly newsletter? When you join my mailing list, you'll receive a free copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And the link is https bit.ly/MHLMEBK21. Okay, so I've outlined this, and if you want to go back and listen to episode 131, gives you more information about bias. So what can we actually do? What is realistic and what is possible? And you might be listening to this and thinking, well, I'm not the head of my organization, so what can I really do? But I would say, going back to the International Women's Day website, there are always things that we can do. So firstly, it is about looking at your current provisions and policies, and are they truly fit for purpose? Now, what do I mean by this? Go and have a look at who they are, how they were written, when they were written, and who is the majority representation. So what are the assumptions? So if it's a special leave policy, for example, now this applies to everyone. And bear in mind, when we improve things for one group of people, and often an example could be around physical adjustments for various disabilities, we're actually improving the environment for everyone. And if you want to know more about this, do check out my episode around accessibility, usability, and universal design and what it really means. But an example I share there is that if we create a ramp at the front of a building, yes, it makes things more accessible for someone who's a wheelchair user. It's also brilliant for people who maybe are pushing a pram, who can't use stairs, they have sore knees, people who've got heavy luggage, lots of things. So we need to think about policies and provisions in exactly the same way. So going back to the example around special leave policy, are we just thinking simply around people who may have given birth and then maybe their child is ill or they're unwell and they have to recover? Now, of course, that's absolutely essential and we need to be doing that. But what about elder care? People who have responsibilities for elder dependents, people who are step parents, when they're things around preparing to go on adoption leave and they need to take leave to sort out papers or see social services. Let's think as big picture as possible. And I've just thrown some examples, many linked to caring, but there are more examples than that. So in order to do that, do you have a representative or representative groups of staff around the table to reduce those chances of groupthink, where everyone is thinking in the same way, and broadening the horizons for everyone? And when we think about women, what I see in workplaces is it's often one type of woman. It tends to be the senior women in an organization who tend to be from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds, who tend to be white. Now, of course, that group of people's views are valid, but there are lots of other views within that. So, and a lot of them tend to be parents, biological parents. So what are the ways in which you need to bring different people around the table, kind of ignore levels in the sense of you need to have a representation of the different levels in workplaces, but not say, oh, they're not senior, they couldn't come on here. I think there's a real issue in many, many organizations that your job grade or the job title determines what you can and can't say and what you can contribute. And for me, that's a really big issue with bias. So if someone's a junior member of staff on an organogram, they're recently joined, or they couldn't possibly contribute, actually that person is ripe to give their opinions and their views. They're new in an organization, they are not institutionalized, they've just joined, so they've been through a recruitment process. That person is actually gold dust and they should be asked to contribute to the wider picture. So in order to do that, think about how will you get these key groups to the table? What is your outreach, encouragement, and action strategy? It's all very well sending an email, inviting people, but that's not necessarily going to cut it, bearing in mind that not everyone will have a desk job, especially in large organizations. There may be people who are out and about, people who don't check their emails as often have that with any facilities, maintenance staff, lab technicians, because they're really busy running around organizing things for people. How are you communicating with any of your trade unions? Think about all of these things. Posters actually in kitchens and on the back of toilet doors do work really well. Unfortunately, I know lots of organizations have stopped this, but when you're in the bathroom in a cubicle looking at something in front of you, I think that is one of the most powerful things. So think about that in detail. How are you going to do that outreach, encouragement, and action strategy? Okay, so let's say you've got this group now of really diverse in its broadest sense group of people. You know the questions they're going to ask. You're going to ask these questions to improve your policies and provisions. How will you make sure that the managers then let their staff take part in these vital change and shaping programs? And this is a hurdle that happens time and time again. It goes back to my point around, if you're junior, your manager is the absolute dominating force and will stop you from doing things. So there's no point in getting involved. So you're just going to carry on. And this is why these gaps exist. Now, of course, managers do have a role. And I appreciate that you can't just, many people say, well, I can't just let my team go off here, there, and everywhere. But I'm sure that changes and tweaks can be made. Nothing is set in stone, as we've seen with the pandemic. No, you can't work at home. No, you can't work at home. Oh, look at surprise. 80% of people were able to work from home, for example. So how do you get the managers on board? If you're a manager, how are you going to encourage your staff member to take part in these activities and maybe even have your own at a team meeting? You can take pick a policy or pick something and say, is this really working for us? What would you like me to feedback if that's not possible? And then finally, at an organizational level, you need to make sure that the feedback you receive is acted upon. So if you have this representative group of people, you've got to act on what they say and also feed back to them and their stakeholders and make sure that that the thoughts are shared in an accessible and multimedia way. Again, it's not just a case of, here's an email, here are the results, as is often done with staff survey. Make it interesting, make it dynamic. There's so many free tools. Get your comms team on board to help you. So it's just really important to think about this in the wider way. We can't just blast through these challenges with solutions. I know that I'm setting out 5 points and there are bits in between, of course. And there does have to be a space where people can vent and express their frustration, anger, and pain without fear of judgment. So there are other things you might like to do in tandem with this. So firstly, it's to create a positive and open questioning culture. And this can be much easier said than done. I know it might be particularly in big organizations. It may be a case where certain teams have got this absolutely down and other teams may be struggling. But just ask open questions. Let's check each other. Let's not assume that the standard way is the best way of doing things. It might be that there needs to be use more research or commission your own research at a sort of small level on the impacts through an intersectional lens. Accept that it's going to be uncomfortable and it's not a good-bad binary, and you have to often lean into that discomfort. But just because you think in a particular way doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, and because you think in another way doesn't necessarily make you a good person. It's not that clear cut, but we all have to constantly challenge each other. I think flexible and agile working as standard is super helpful, and of course, that has changed over time as people have been able to do this. And this used to be much more of an issue. So flexible working, people choosing their hours, where they work and how they work, and agile working, which kind of links to that, which is being able to work in different environments if it's cyber safe and safe for the people that you're working with or your organization. I think also in terms of breaking the bias is looking at those psychological risk assessments alongside health and safety for the hybrid environment. We've seen so much in terms of mental ill health developing because people feel isolated, and yet for other people their mental health has become really, really much better because they don't have to interact with certain people on a day-to-day basis. So don't make a psychological risk assessment for someone who may experience mental ill health, but look at any job and any portfolio and look at that psychological risk along with the physical health and safety risk. And if we really want to break the bias on a bigger level, but in particular, if we think that women are still very much in a caring role, and if there is bereavement is experienced, what kind of digital support and therapy, including looking at the cultural elements. And I think being a carer and then losing someone and that grieving process, it's never, ever easy for anyone. But if you've been caring for someone, I think that there are different elements to that. So how does your organization take that into account as well? And as I said, this process of breaking the bias doesn't happen overnight, and it is about embracing discomfort. And we could talk about this in relation to race equity, misogyny, ableist behavior. So the first thing, how do you embrace discomfort is for those of us who are in underrepresented, marginalized groups, we have to sit with discomfort a lot So we don't have a choice. And of course, we don't just sit in one box. We might sit in, many of the different identity aspects. And for those people who don't, it's really important that this is not easy work, but you do have to be prepared to embrace discomfort. So step one, acknowledge your feelings, what's going on in your head, but also what's happened to you physiologically. And that includes uncertainty and guilt, and focus on experiencing your emotions. Don't try and push them away, and reflect on where do you feel it in your body. Make a note of it and be really conscious about it. And it might be that some of those physiological sensations might link to the same sensations you have in your body when you experience stress. The second thing is to please recognize that by rationalizing everything and trying to make sense, and yes, it's great to have data, but please don't use data javelins, what I call data javelins, which is throwing the data and saying, oh, well, there we go. Oh, we need some more. We need some more. We need some more. And oh, that data javelin's landed over there. Let's keep measuring the distance and let's stop. We have so much information. We have so much data. It doesn't make the issue disappear, and understand that the solution may be vastly different to the one that is usually proposed or used. So take a step back, look at the information, but don't always try and rush to a solution. Ponder it, acknowledge your feelings, and think about what could we do differently. And often it's not differently. The response to breaking the bias can be, let's have an event and set up a women's network. While that is really important, I'm not saying don't do it. There are going to be other ways to do things. So gender pay gap, or let's look at our budgets and look at how we can equalize that. Let's check our pension gaps. How are we going to support people with this? What information could we give people? Could we have some drop-in financial advisors once a month that come in? And that is going to be far more effective in most cases than having a one-off event that people can't go to because their managers don't say yes and they're overworked and they've got caring responsibilities. And the third thing around embracing discomfort is asking pertinent questions to learn and understand more. And this will, of course, link to my point about creating a positive and open questioning culture. And this is going to aid in developing a sustainable action plan to take forward. So we want to acknowledge those feelings. We want to take a step back, look at the bigger picture, not try and rationalize everything, keep asking the questions, and that will aid the understanding of a sustainable action plan to take forward. Now, if you think you've done all this, please message me, because in my eyes, no organization has solved it. There might be departments or smaller areas within workplaces that have, but we have to consider and think about all of this. And it really goes beyond simply having one 90-minute unconscious bias training session and thinking it's all done. This is a changed way of working. And when we have any kind of change, we experience discomfort. So if we want to break the bias, it can genuinely break the bias and challenge things beyond International Women's Day. It can feel like working in a different way is like going back to the beginning and starting again when things have been done in a certain way for so long. It is challenging renegotiating our understanding of what we want power to look like. And even the term power can be desperately uncomfortable given legacies in organizations, but also societal power and where we are now. It's important to set boundaries for ourselves and with others. How much do we want to be involved? What will we get involved in? And if things don't go the way in which we want it to, how will we contribute, but also step back? I think it's important to remember what we do and don't have control over. So I mentioned that you might be listening to this and thinking, this is all a bit pie in the sky because I don't feel very senior, I don't have much influence. But remember what you do and don't have control over, and also what you have influence over. Again, using authenticity, this isn't about manipulation, but it's really key to remember that. And you will have some kind of workplace community and how that community can help, and you can have these discussions. And that everyone will have different experiences and triggers and what breaking the bias means to them and what biases they want to see eliminated. So yes, gender and equity, but also the other facets of themselves. And this needs to be considered. So I really hope you've enjoyed this special episode for International Women's Day, all about how can we really break the bias. And if you've enjoyed the show, please, why not leave me a review on Apple or Spotify podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And don't forget the extra resources that are in the show notes. So I wish you a very happy International Women's Day, and thinking about our actions and what we can do to break biases all year around. Until then, I'll see you in the next episode. Take care, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.